All right, so for those of you that don't know, the American Friends of Lafayette are about to start celebrating the bicentennial of Lafayette's farewell tour to the United States. Starting on August 15th, we're going to travel around the country. Please mute yourselves. We're going to travel around the country following Lafayette's footsteps in the same order that Lafayette went. It's very exciting. And right now we have over 200 events planned during the course of those 13 months and 6,000 miles that Lafayette traveled. And in many of those events, there's going to be parties and balls. Some events are going to be more educational. But tonight we're going to be talking about the parties and balls. And one of those parties we're going to have is in Old Sturbridge Village on September 3rd, the same exact day that Lafayette was in Sturbridge Village. That's how we're working it. In other words, if he was in your town on November 3rd, we'll be there on November 3rd. And that's how it's working. But today, we have two wonderful people joining us from Sturbridge Village that are going to talk to us about how best to dress for that ball that you might be going to celebrate Lafayette's bicentennial. And I'd like to introduce these two people, and they're on the screen with us today. And I would suggest that everybody change your view to speaker view. That way you can have the speaker be the person that you see the most. And that would be in the upper right-hand corner. You'll see a little thing that says view, and click on that and click to speaker view. And that'll make it so that you can see these two wonderful people on your screen instead of me. Fair enough? Okay. All right. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Derek and Carrie from Old Sturbridge Village.
Thank you very much, Chuck. It's great to be here with Carrie, talking about this with you folks tonight. Basically, the way we wanted to break this up tonight is first starting off with women's clothing. So Carrie's going to be speaking to that. And then I'll be speaking to the men's clothing is kind of the second part of this. But the whole goal for this meeting tonight is to really give you all a sense of, what people would have worn in 1824, both just in terms of dress clothing, but also, when they were greeting Lafayette when he was coming to their town or going to various events and things like that. I will kind of say as a word of warning, I guess, at the beginning of this. Unfortunately, although we all here love 1824 and think it's pretty much the coolest time period there is, it is tricky, I will say, to find adequate clothing that really fits the bill if the type of event you're trying to do for the Lafayette commemorations is more of an authentic reenactment. So what Carrie and I are going to talk about tonight is really getting to the basics of the clothing, looking at a lot of different examples in museum collections, both Old Sturbridge Village and other museum collections as well, and just try to give you more of a sense of the real aesthetic of the time period, and then where appropriate, give you information on how you can source some materials, but more importantly, from our standpoint, where you can source the patterns from making these types of things. So that's really the angle we're trying to approach this at tonight, is how can you, with a variety of different patterns, supplies, things like that, actually try to make some of the clothing that would be appropriate for 1824 or for the different events you'll be going to. So with that, Carrie, I'm not sure if you have anything you want to say in opening before you launch into your awesome slideshow.
Okay, sorry, that cut out for a second. So I think you just introduced me. So I'm going to take it from here. Thank you for the introduction. And thank you, Chuck, for having both Derek and I. We are, as he said, very excited to be talking about Lafayette's visit. And we'll again be focusing on how to make the most of the resources that are currently available for those that want to take part in these events. Again, for those I haven't met, I see a lot of familiar faces and names attending tonight, so thank you. My name is Carrie Madura. I am the coordinator of historical clothing and households at Old Sturbridge Village. And if you're familiar with us, you'll know that we live primarily in the 1830s, but the 1820s is a period that I first started doing, actually thanks to Derek, because some of the militia programs we do there really focus on 1820s. So somewhere in my history, I have some really bad photos of me like trying to make pull together what I could for 1820s as well. So I'm definitely talking about doing this from my own experience. So I am going to see if I can share my screen here. Give us one moment to go into presentation mode. There we go. All right, a reminder for those that haven't muted their screen, muted their Zoom calls, if you could do that for me now, partly because I'm easily distracted. So there we go. All right. So Lafayette is coming, and we know he was here in Sturbridge specifically in 1824, but part of my past life actually was in Andover, Massachusetts, where he visited in 1825 as well. So we'll be kind of encompassing that mid-1820s period. Fashion moved fast, but not so fast that a lot of things won't boil over into both of those years. As we go through this, you'll see, oops, there we go. As you go through this, you'll see I'm going to be using a variety of fashion plates, extant garments, portraits, and as well as modern reproductions and some make-dos as well. So I'll be offering tips and suggestions on how to work with what is widely available and trying to cater to a wide variety of skill sets as well. I know some people love to do everything for themselves, sewing from the inside out. Others want to look for things to purchase, and there are those that are in between. What I did find in going through the recollections of those that actually did get to meet Lafayette in 1824 and 1825 is that for women's clothing, there were two main types of events that women were interacting with Lafayette. It was the larger public receptions and him parading through towns. And then there were a couple of evening balls. Those were mostly happening in Boston and some of the larger cities. But I will try to touch on both kind of everyday day wear as well as the fancier stuff that I know many of us get excited about. The one thing I will note is that there is a huge amount of white dresses listed, and that is kind of a very typical parade attire, greeting attire, ceremonial attire to celebrate special occasions. So you will see a lot of references throughout my presentation about white dresses. And if you're only going to do one, that is a great way to kind of get one thing to do many kind of multiple uses. It can be dressed up or down for different occasions. If it's a lightweight silk or a really, really nice white Indian muslin cotton, both of those can kind of go from day wear into evening, depending on some of those accessories and things that you're doing. For those that are focused on a very historically accurate event or reenactment, one thing to keep in mind is the time of year that's happening. For us in Sturbridge, this is happening in the first week of September, coming right off of Labor Day weekend for us today. And that's warm around here. So keeping in mind, not looking into sort of the heavy velvets and heavy silks and heavy satins and loaded down with lots of accessories, definitely kind of play into some of the choices that we're making. So starting from the inside out, I'm going to go kind of through all of the layers of clothing. So closest to the body, we have the shift or chemise. The French term had kind of taken over by this point. And anything from France just sounds way cooler than if it's coming from the United States or England. You call it what you need to. We have a couple here that are from, the one on the left is from Old Sturbridge Village's collection, and it's pretty typical shift chemise. These have not changed widely by this period. The one from Old Sturbridge Village on the left, you'll see has a deep neck cut in the front and the back. Basically, you can't tell the front from the back in this one, aside from the initial markings. The one on the right is from the V&A in England. And that one does have a higher neckline in the back. Both of those you see through this period. This was one place I didn't add a lot of specific pattern suggestions, partly because these garments, for the most part, have not changed from much of the 18th century into the early 19th century. The differences you tend to see are narrower and shorter sleeves, but not a lot more beyond that. So this is where Google can very much be your friend. You're looking for a typical standard shift or chemise pattern. Quite frankly, we rely on the Workwoman's Guide, printed in 1838, and you can see an illustration from that up in the right-hand corner. And the shift is essentially the same design that has been being used for many decades at this point. And the Workwoman's Guide is a book that is freely available via Google Books for anyone to peruse. All those plates, the dimensions are there as well. That shift, for those that aren't familiar with all of the elements of the layering of women's clothing, that shift is what's worn closest to the body. It is almost universally white in linen or cotton so that it can be easily laundered. And it's what's going to act as a buffer between your body and that next foundation garment that we'll see here. This is a pair of stays or a corset. The terms are fairly interchangeable at this point. In fact, we do have some diary entries that tend to refer to both of them about the same garment in the same entry. This particular pair is from Old Sturbridge Village again. You'll see me using a lot of our collections throughout this talk. And as one of my favorites, it's one I actually got to pattern myself, and has really darling heart motifs that are then corded. It is a relatively soft corset. There is almost no boning in it anywhere. So it is designed to work with the curves of the body. There is a busk, that is the wooden piece that you see sticking out from the front pocket in that word photograph in the upper right. And that's going to provide some support to the body, as well as sort of that flat, flattering figure shape to the front of what you're wearing. The cording is providing the stiffening in this garment, and it is going to create and accent the curves of the body in a very flattering way. The waistline for the 1820s is above the natural waistline, but not quite as severe as what we think of as Regency or early federal fashion. It is starting to drop. So that's where you're seeing some of that cording go horizontally around the body and sort of lowering some of those support points. The corsets and stays in general are not a difficult garment to make. There's a lot of sewing to them, but none of the sewing is particularly difficult. So in this case, I did outline a couple of options here. And I just need to move things on my screen so I can actually see and point out when I'm talking. There we go. And this particular pattern is actually available in the newest publication, Old Sturbridge Village, Needle and Thread. Derek can talk more about that because he is one of the authors of the book that we published. But in that book, there are 6 graphed patterns taken from the original garments that we share. And we included this one. So if you buy the book, pattern comes with it. It is a scaled diagram, so it fits the one person it was made for. So you may want to brush up a little bit on your enlarging and scaling skills to try to make this for yourself. Along those same lines is corsets. There's a pair of stays in Corsets and Crinolines, a book by Nora Waugh that is available through interlibrary loan. Many costumers will very likely have this on their shelf as well. That's the same thing. It is a scaled diagram of an original corset. So it is meant to fit that one person.
Something like that, opposed to.
I think we need someone to mute themselves, if you don't
I
mind.
guess we're just talking about, awareness, just run it by the treasurer, just that.
Let's see.
The finance committee and the chapter as a whole, rather than just.
Yeah, don't
Oh,
put the
excuse me.
treasurer in the hot seat, make it the finance committee. I mean,
Hey,
again, I can see why it
hello.
would be off-putting
All
to
right,
say. it
Carrie,
has to
I'm
be
gonna
approved,
mute
but
all,
again,
and then
I
I'm
feel
gonna
like I'm
unmute you,
accountable for
okay?
where the money goes. And it was just like a shock to me that, there was no discussion of, hey,
Okay, we're back. Thank you, Chuck. And okay, so Corsets and Crinolines, Nora Waugh, great pattern in there. And but that's a scale drawing of an original corset. It fits that one person that it was made for. If you want to take the next step up, I can highly recommend Mandy Barrington's book, Stays and Corsets. Those are drafting instructions based on original corsets, but it does walk you through all of the steps of creating a basic body block for the measurements of the person you're taking, and then translating that into a stays pattern that fits you specifically or the person you're measuring. I've used both of her books extensively, making a number of patterns from them. And if you follow the steps and you're not afraid of, pulling up your phone to do some calculations and use that calculator app to do some drafting points, it's a really, really great tool to get a very well fitted and accurate set. If you don't want to go and spend some time doing math, kind of moving down the list, the Laughing Moon patterns, the Ladies Regency and Romantic Era corset is one I highly, highly recommend. Her instructions for how to get an accurate fit are fantastic. And that the corset stays pattern is really good for providing a base shape from kind of early 1800s, really almost up until about 1840. You can pad out with your other foundation layers, but it gives sort of a solid body encasing garment there. Genesee Country Village has been patterning their corsets. So they have a number of corsets, including one from the 1820s up on their website. And that one is also graphed to one size, but it does have a lot more detail to it that takes a little bit of the guesswork out. And then last, but certainly not least, are the red threaded patterns, which I'm also a fan of. We use both Laughing Moon and red threaded patterns and all of these others at Sturbridge Village. They're also ones that I use personally in working on different time periods. And the one caution I will offer on the red threaded stays, she doesn't have one that's specifically 1820s. But depending on the look of the garment you're going for, if you're going for a little bit more high fashion where the waist is dropping a little bit lower, or 1830s pattern is fantastic. If you're going for a little bit old fashioned, the Regency long stays are great. I would stay away from short stays. They don't tend to kind of hit low enough to support that dropped waistline. So once we move on from the stays, we are looking at, there we go. The petticoats and bustles and bums and sort of those other foundation pieces. Bodice petticoats here are your friend. Again, because the waistline is higher than natural, it's hard to keep a petticoat seated properly at your waist. So a petticoat with straps over the shoulder, a petticoat that is attached to essentially a sleeveless bodice, usually that's a scary term, but not in this case. The one on the left is probably pretty close to right on for our period. The one on the right from the MFA in Boston might be a little bit earlier, but again, for the shapes that we're going for, it will do the job that we need it to. We want something to be higher up and get the fullness of the skirt just a little bit higher than our natural waistline. Laughing Moon makes a great, Laughing Moon makes a great bodice petticoat pattern, which provides the foundation for, kind of going in either direction. You can lengthen the bodice a little bit, you can shorten the bodice a little bit, depending on what your final goal is for the outer layers. I do include this illustration, which is from the Book of English Trades. It was being published throughout the end of the 18th century into the 19th century. And although the edition that I flipped to this page from was published in 1824, the same exact illustration publishes in 1811. So I would caution you as you're looking at period sources, if you do that sort of a deep dive, to just sort of, if you find illustrations like this, take them with a grain of salt because they may be being copied from earlier ideas. Maybe they couldn't afford to get an engraver, get a whole new look for the dressmaker's plate for that edition. Let's see. For bodice petticoats also, you can take almost any one of your dress patterns and slim down the bodice and build take the sleeves off and build the petticoat skirt off of that as well, and layer that underneath the dress. So both of those are viable options for those that are comfortable doing a little bit of tweaking with their patterns. Now on to the good stuff. So that top layer is where we really get to have some fun. As I mentioned at the beginning of this part of the presentation, you can't go wrong with white, but that doesn't mean that that was universally being worn by everyone. This is one of our favorites in the collection at Old Sturbridge Village. It is a coat dress, a red goat. There's lots of different names for it. We have it listed as a dress in our collection, but it does open up the front with a belt sort of overlaps and closes it so it looks like one finished piece. The collar, the ruffled piece around the neck, is a separate piece in this case. And as far as patterns go, again, Laughing Moon in this one. I do recommend other patterns, but Laughing Moon happened to hit a couple key points so far. The Laughing Moon red and goat pattern is a police pattern for this that you'll see in a moment. The elements that we're looking for in the mid 1820s are that raised above natural waist, but not just under the bust. So it should be somewhere kind of upper low torso. And you do still see some things coming in a little bit closer to the neckline. You start to see some of the fullness of the sleeves that we know gets completely out of hand at the end of the decade, going into the 1830s. And the fullness of the skirts is still very much in the back. So the fronts of the relatively flat, they start to get a little bit full to the side and hip, and then really all of the emphasis is in the back, which you see in that illustration on the right. That can be done with bum pads and pleating petticoats the same way. In fact, that previous pattern mentioned by Laughing Moon, it does include bum pads and those other accessories to add on. Now, when we look at them side by side, you can see a lot of similarities here. The having made this particular garment before from the Laughing Moon pattern, it does skew a little bit earlier with the shorter puffed sleeves. There's not quite as much fullness in the upper sleeve. But again, swapping out different patterns, if you have a little bit of creativity and drafting skills or a lot of excess muslin to test out some pattern changes, it's really only the sleeves and how high or low you want the waistline on this one. The fullness at the back is already there. A little bit more could be shifted towards the front. And then, although this one does close overlapping, it's very easy to adjust that sew up part of the front so it's a step-in front dress, and then affix the waistband belt so it looks like a finished garment. The collars on this pattern, the Laughing Moon pattern, are all attached, but you'll see a couple slides down when we get to some of the accessories that the same fancy white accessories we use to put on top of a fancy dress can be made out of the matching fabric, and it would create this collar as well. So this is another one as we start getting into some of the fancier clothes. It is a silk dress in our collection. And here's where you start seeing a lot of the applied trim coming into play in the 1820s. I don't know how people had so much time to do this. This is a little bit more painstaking work, and I definitely recommend anyone wanting to embark on adding this kind of trim with all of the piping and shaping and detailing to leave yourself excess time, because this stuff takes much longer than you think it's going to every single time. This particular dress is a silk taffeta. It is a very, very fine stripe. We had varying degrees of photographs available of this one. The photograph all the way on the left that shows the very detailed trim from the bottom skirt is the truest color. It is sort of a brown and tan micro stripe with a ivory piping around all of those pieces. Everything that you see, the scallops, see with my mouse, the scallops here, this band here, this ruching, this piping and the bottom band, that is all applied on a base skirt. So you can start with a plain skirt and add your trim as you get it finished, or as you have time to add more. The same thing goes for the bodice. These bodice pieces are applied almost after the fact. You may want to tuck some into the neckline and finish them nicely, but almost all of this trim can get applied after the fact. So if you're in a rush, you can have that plain gown and then go on to trim it as time allows. There is two dress patterns I'd recommend, one by Laughing Moon and one by Black Snail, that both have good bones to create this pattern as well. I should note that although Chuck said this webinar is being recorded, we are going to put together a document that sort of lists all the sources that we are including as well, and the links that we are showing on screen too. This is an absolutely stunning one. It's a silk and wool blend that is very sheer in parts. The crossover bodice is very popular. You see it in a number of fashion plates. I will say that this is a harder one to find patterns for. So the sleeve fullness, you can absolutely use the truly Victorian 1830s dress. It has a really full, beautiful sleeve that is set far off the shoulder. And it actually has a pretty good base bodice as well. The things you would want to do for that one would be shortening the overall torso and maybe creating a base lining and then draping your fashion fabric, in this case, the beautiful sort of cream and ivory striped wool over the top of that. The back pieces are essentially not any different than the truly Victorian 1830s dress. And the skirt on this one essentially isn't any different than the Laughing Moon, the Black Snail patterns. So the skirts are relatively interchangeable here, and you can take and try those different pieces together. Part of it is really just identifying the elements that you're going for and feeling confident that you've chosen an 1820s style to move forward with. And in this case, we're up in frugal New England. A lot of our research is going to be skewed that way. There is nothing wrong with taking a dress to be 1822, 1823, and doing some updating to it to kind of pull out all the stops to meet with Lafayette as well. Now getting into the whites. So this stunning one on the left that has all of that applied chiffon detailing that's all bound with silk satin over a silk damask bodice. Stunning, absolutely stunning. This particular one was a wedding dress, white wedding dress, being a little bit odd at this time, but it was a beautiful dress and beautifully finished. But again, all of those elements are applied afterward. The dress itself is a fairly basic style. Where you see you're starting to get a little bit of the widened neckline. The bodice has two darts in the front. It does have a side panel in addition to a side back panel and center back panel. This one closes up the back, has it's about 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches waistband. And again, still you can see how smooth and flat the dress skirt is in the front, and all of the fullness falls to the back. Whether or not this was, the most up to date or the pinnacle of fashion depends on where this dress was being worn. This one happens to be from the Met. They get some of the really good collections. But you see, it's also very similar to what we see for a ball dress from an illustration. This one also comes from the Met Museum digital collection. And again, basic dress. This has a rouleau of trim along the neckline, dipping down into a V. It has flowers and gathered trim, creating the kind of looping circles around the hem, and then a much thicker gathered ruching or rouleau hem at the bottom. So the dress on the left, excellent example, one that would totally work for a ball. The sleeves on this quite possibly are removable. I apologize, I don't remember the details, but you can follow that link and check it out for yourself again. And the dress on the right, balls tend to see a lot more short sleeves and the short puff sleeves there. But you can find those parallels and see where the extant dresses are gaining inspiration and vice versa, as you're choosing your own. Now, I think finishing up with the white dresses, the one on the right is from Sturbridge Village's collection. It hasn't had a recent photograph taken, so I stole one of the older ones. But this is a white cotton, nothing fancy to the fabric itself. Your basic kind of white lining fabric, white cotton lining fabric would work great for this. However, you want to take it that next step up, doing some embroidery, finding applied trim that has already ornamented for you is a great solution. The piece on the left is a close-up of another gown in our collection I didn't have a full-length photograph of. And you can see all that beautiful white work. That was something that was being done domestically here by individuals, but also you are getting imports of fabric already pre-embroidered. So you should never feel guilty about buying things that are already embroidered for you. And combining those to create the look that you want. The dress on the right can be pretty well mimicked by the black snail pattern for the Empire Regency evening dress. And simply by adding another ruffle to the skirt. So it's just adding straight piece, much fuller, and tacking that on at the right length. In terms of embroidery, should you be ambitious and want to be one of those people that does it yourself, and I tend to be guilty as charged, so I completely understand if you're one of them as well. The Lady's Stratagem is a book by Frances Grimble that uses a lot of 1820s fashion plates, fashion magazines, extant articles, and many of them are translated from the French. And she compiled it into a like 2-inch thick volume that's just a lot of really great resources. They're very 1820s specific. Some of it isn't fashion related. It's sort of the toilette and caring for clothing, so things we don't need to worry about. But there are some actual embroidery patterns taken from different magazines in there. And that's a book that, again, available through interlibrary loan. For those that are frugal-minded and want to have the same experience as our counterparts from the 1820s, Jenny Batchelor has, who's done a couple of books on embroidery for the Jane Austen era. She has a huge project called the Patterns of Perfection, where she has been digitizing and making available all of the 600 some odd embroidery designs from the Ladies Magazine from the 1790s through the 1830s. So if you haven't taken a look at that, it's amazing. It's an open source website. You can find them, download them, use them the way you use any other embroidery pattern. For those that want a little bit more of a modern tutorial, I can personally recommend Romantic Recollections. She is the woman who started this, Denise, she is a historical costumer herself and was creating designs to be used by modern embroidery machines, also a fan, but also she's taken those designs and kind of charted them out and drew them out to make them easier to apply for hand embroidery as well. Most of the stitches for embroidery are pretty simple, time consuming, just like the stays, but pretty simple to learn and move forward with. This particular design that I included on the screen is from 1823. I think it might be Ladies Magazine as well, but in a more user-friendly format. And as someone who formerly had been a pattern tester for her and owns many of her designs in particular, I really like her stuff, both for handwork and if you're fortunate enough to have an embroidery machine and want to use it there as well. So where can you put all the embroidery if you don't want to do an entire dress? Well, caps and headwear are a good place. And the further I dive into the 1820s, the more I'm enjoying it sort of as the baby sister to the really crazy 1830s. And this cap on the left is a great example. There's a lot going on. It really is sort of a trial run for the caps of madness that come into play in the 1830s. And so it can be done simple. Again, this is kind of plain cotton, lightweight muslin, and just has insertion lace piecing the sections together. all the way up to a embroidered net or bobinette cap from the MFA Boston on the right that is tambour worked or chain stitch embroidered all the way around all of the edges and finished that way. And then the centerpiece, speaking of other free designs, is for an embroidery template that is available on the Old Sturbridge Village Collections website. We have a number of embroidery templates. This one actually notes on it that it was for a cap pattern. We don't know the exact dates, but it is in keeping with styles of kind of the generally 18 teens, 20s, and 30s patterns. It's pretty ambitious. So starting with a cap or a reticule or a small piece like that is a great way to decide how much of your time you want to commit to embroidery. Next layer up from the caps, we have some hats and bonnets. So bonnets and hats are nearly as bonkers here as they are in the following decade. I am particularly partial to one on the left, this straw bonnet, because the shape is basic, but it's actually flat applied straw to it. So there are some bonnet forms that I will talk about in a few minutes that are available from Timely Tresses. And you could absolutely apply pieces of flattened straw to a bonnet like that, line it with silk the way the original is, and no one would be the wiser, and you'd have a really, really unique, very period appropriate cap for kind of the cost of the form and some relatively inexpensive straw supplies. The the straw hat with the beautiful blue ribbon is very typical for the 1820s period. We still have a number of them at Sturbridge Village that we use for special programs. In the period, it was known as a gypsy bonnet. I am choosing not to use that going forward. We refer to them as straw tall hats for women in deference to not wanting to cause any hurt by using inappropriate language. But if you are doing searches through period documents and so on, that is often the term that it will be used to refer to it. They're very similar to the men's tall hats. You see different grades of straw. So for those that have done any straw bonnet making themselves, same concept, straw gets sewn together. They too tend to be pretty high crowned. So we're looking at 6-7 inches. Fairly narrow. It's going to be smaller in scale than men's hats, and Derek will dive down that alley in a few minutes. And almost invariably, you see really, really wide ribbons trimming them. The fashion illustration that I have in the corner, the ribbons are covered with plumes, but the ribbons are also there. It is tricky to track down really high quality, certainly silk ribbons of that width. It tends to be vintage and antique pieces, but there's nothing wrong with making your own, cutting a wider piece of silk into the strips that are appropriate for the width of ribbon you want. Does involve hemming a bit, but we have months and months to go before Lafayette gets here, so we should all have some time to do that. I mentioned earlier the collar that matched the pelerine. That matched the police coat dress in the serpentine stripe from the Old Sturbridge Village collection. This is a Van Dyke or collar cape combination from Sturbridge's collection. A Van Dyke in the 1830s, according to Webster, actually referred to this specific garment, a cape and a collar combined, a cape being something that reached to your shoulder, a collar being something that was limited to being around your neck. The Van Dyke edging is also part of it. So this is a Van Dyke with Van Dyke edging. Referring to that very zigzag finish, which was reflected back going to the Van Dyke paintings of previous centuries. This one is from the Old Sturbridge Village collection, and actually I think it's one we've patterned, but it's a really basic shape. And in fact, it is nearly identical to a number of the collar and cape shapes that appear again in the Workwoman's Guide. So while the Workwoman's Guide is an 1838 publication, the shapes haven't changed. So going for that basic cape collar, whichever one you want, you can get the foundational shapes from Workwoman's Guide. These are free patterns available. and most of them all of them have very clear instructions on how big to make them, and all the measurements are listed there as well. As far as shoes go, we have passed the point of pointed toe shoes. We really are into sort of round, edging towards square-toed shoes for this period. Slippers are kind of the main thing to be looking at. So whether they're satin or leather or calico wool, all of those are appropriate. You do small details like bows, ruching, pleating, even embroidery on those. As far as reproductions go, many people on this call will be familiar with American Duchess shoes. There are other less high quality knockoffs out there doing reproduction shoes. There's not a lot of 1820 on the market right now, so that are ready, that are not secondhand. So you can keep an eye out for those. One of the shoes that I particularly lean towards, which I forgot to put a link in here, but it's one of my favorites, is made by the Madewell Shoe Company, which is a very modern shoe company, but they issued a flat slipper, ballet slipper that is, the name is Cory, C-O-R-Y is the style name. And it's just a great flat, well, like blends in, has minimal stitching, that really looks the part. It's also a extremely comfortable shoe. It's one I wear in my daily life as well as when I need to be in costume. And they were produced in about 5 different colors, from sort of a bone, all in real leather too, bone black, a coral orange, a blush nude, and a really, really fabulous kind of Loden green. And those can be found on Poshmark and eBay and Etsy and places like that for pretty low money. They were not an expensive shoe when they were first being made, but secondhand, you can pick them up pretty inexpensively. And I definitely recommend those if you don't want to go kind of fully down the very historically accurate shoe. In a pinch, ballet slippers are great, and there are a bunch of kind of plain, simple black ballet shoes, ballet flats being made by Target and Walmart that you can find there. As someone who generally is outfitting people that have to be on their feet and in shoes for a 6 to 8 to 10 hour workday, I use those sparingly. So those are more like sitting shoes. If you're going to be standing for hours waiting for Lafayette to arrive, definitely test them out at home before those days, because have found that some of the shoes are not quite as comfortable for longer lengths of time. The dress length for the 1820s it does trend a tiny bit shorter, but you can also always cheat the look of your shoes by keeping your skirts a little bit longer, and then that gives you a little bit more coverage, and you can go for some more sort of straight Regency shoes and booties, which are a little bit more widely available. So wrapping up, kind of last couple of things are those accessories. So the one on the top is a silk ribbon sash or ribbon that is in the Sturbridge Village collection with a stamp of Lafayette's image on it. These were widely available in 1824 and 1825, some being made domestically, many being imported from France to cater towards the Lafayette enthusiasm. The gloves at the bottom, one pair is from the Massachusetts Historical Society, the other is from the Met. So there's both evening ball gloves and day wear gloves. Eric will share link and information about someone who's producing some of the stitches and ribbons right now. But if you're creative and know how to print on fabric, this is something that you can create your own. And honestly, there'll probably be a market for it if you start getting into that. Parasols, great. Black is always simple. Lighter colors for the better weather. Gingham and plaids. I am obsessed with the idea of having more of these because they are advertised widely as being a common item being sold. Earrings are often going to have that classical influence, and looking for things that have French influence, as a nod to the respect that people were paying towards Lafayette is a great way to go. And of course, stockings. This is a period where you can have a little bit of fun with a little bit of detail in your stockings. But for the most part, you just want to make sure that they're coming up over, up at least to your knee, so that as skirts are like moving around and so on, you're not showing any leg. Last but not least, before I turn this over to Derek, I did want to share some information about 2 upcoming workshops. I can't speak to whether or not they are full, but if anyone is on this call and wants to add something, if there's a chat available, Burnley and Trowbridge is running a workshop, and I believe a second one will be added later in the year with Samantha Bullitt, who will be doing an in-person workshop that'll be taking place in the Williamsburg, Virginia area. And that's in March, I think. And then fig leaf patterns and timely tresses are joining very powerful forces to go through one of the newest fig leaf patterns, 225 that you see here. Mackenzie Schultz is drafting, and her patterns are fantastic. I didn't include a lot in the references here because many of hers skew a little bit earlier for our purposes of this talk. But if you're good with doing a little bit of drafting and adjusting, highly recommend the fig leaf patterns. And I mentioned earlier about bonnet forms and patterns that you could cover with that straw. And Danielle at Timely Tresses, this is one of her bonnets, and it's a beautiful 1820s poke bonnet, great shape. She sells both the forms, the patterns, the kits, finished bonnets as well. These are all some of my personal recommendations as well. These are all fantastic people to talk to about some of your costuming needs and or potentially take workshops with as well. So check them out online and through the links that we send. I am going to skip over the question slide because we'll sort of save those for afterward. And I'm going to kind of quickly put my information up on the screen. You can absolutely reach out to me at Sturbridge Village. So cmadura@osb.org. You can find me on Instagram. And I have a rather crazy Pinterest board of romantic era fashion. So a lot of the stuff is on there as well. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn things over to Derek.
Thank you, Carrie. And we will do a Q&A at the end of this session after Derek's done. Thank you very much.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, thank you for that, Carrie. That was awesome. I'll get mine started now. Okay. So like Carrie showed you, it really is a mixture of period imagery and objects survive that are really good inspiration for as you're trying to pull together different types of looks for these different events that you're doing. I'm going to go through and show you a bunch of different pieces. I mean, with men's clothing in the period, honestly, just like men's clothing today, you don't tend to see the same variety that you see with women's clothing. So what I'm going to be talking about are kind of more of the general styles that you see, the type of coat that's most common, the type of vest that's most common, things like that. So we'll make our way through. I'm going to start with talking about portraits. So portraits, we have many great portraits in the OSU Museum collection. We have the portrait left here of the unidentified man from New England for the 1820s, and this portrait from 1825 of Southworth Allen Howland, which is just beautiful, beautiful portrait showing a lot of these, the hairstyle, the shirts, the stocks, the coats, how all these pieces really fit together in the time period. And I certainly encourage you as you're thinking about, what you want your look to look like for these type of events you're going to consult different museum collections. I mean, the great thing right now is so many museums are digitizing lots and lots of their collection. At OSV, we're doing it every week. But lots of the museums, the Met, like Carrie had referenced, Williamsburg, lots of museums are adding some really wonderful pieces to their digital collections that you can access. So I would strongly suggest that you start by, starting to look around and see what other types of things are available or inspirations for you. along with the portraits, though, which are great because they are representations of people from the period, and you can see how they dressed for the more formal situation of sitting for a portrait. They want to be reflected in their finest clothing. So that's a nice way to look at it from one perspective. But we also have tailoring manuals, and that's something we're really fortunate in the early 19th century. These manuals really take off quite a bit. The one that I found to be the most useful for the 1820s is the Tailor's Friendly Instructor by J. Wyatt. So this is printed in London in 1822. And it not only has a very extensive list of different garments for men, boys, and even some for women as well, but it has a lot of great images. You can see here just the way that the forms are shown. So if you're working on actually making your own clothing, or even if you're getting clothing made for you, there's all sorts of reference marks you can see that are listed on the forms that are shown that will give you a sense of how the clothing should really fit you. Which I think is very, very important to make sure that you're not just wearing clothing that's appropriate, but that it actually fits you appropriately too. It's important to remember that the 1820s are before we really start to see a lot of the ready-made clothing industry start to come into its own. That's more of an 1830s, 1840s thing. So a lot of the clothing is really being made for the individuals and fitted very well to the individuals. So that's just important to keep in mind. But I would highly recommend, if you are trying to go more of the really immersive route, if you have the experience with actually drafting your own patterns, even if you don't and want to experiment, this is actually a really great tailoring manual that I have personally used, and again have made some great clothing that actually fits really, really well and is very comfortable. So I'll start by moving through here and just talking about, like Carrie did, the various different layers. So I will also start at the base layer, effectively the underwear, with the shirt. Much like a woman's shift, shirts are pretty basic for men in the time period. The example showing it right here is a very typical work shirt of the early 19th century. So we can see the standing collar here. We can see the sleeve that is gathered into the body here with a longer cuff on it. There's typically in our time period just a long slit. You're starting to see some shirts that do actually button up to some extent, but not with a full-on placket. And you also see for fancier shirts in the period, the 20s are getting towards the end of the time period where bosom ruffles are actually still very fashionable. These are even talked about, Carrie had referenced the Workwoman's Guide. They're still even talked about in 1838, but still as kind of a more old-fashioned way of dressing up your shirt. But when it comes to a shirt in the time period, white is certainly going to be the most common. That'll give you the most longevity and the most flexibility for a lot of different events you could be doing. Linen is still certainly the most common, but there is a lot of cotton as well that's being used for shirts in that time period as well. In terms of patterns with shirts, because they are such simple garments, I would recommend basically just doing what Carrie had said for the shirts, for shifts. Googling things online. I would personally start probably with the Workwoman's Guide, because I do think that it is, although again slightly later, very, very good at giving you the basics of not only how to cut out the shirt, but how to actually put it together. So big, basically unfitted garments, the only part that actually are tailored to the individual are the collar and the cuffs. And aside from that, they are pretty kind of billowy, voluminous garments that are tucked under all the other layers of clothing. Moving on from that, we have pantaloons. And there is quite a variety of different shapes and styles of pantaloons in the time period. Some are very, very fitted. Some are actually very baggy. By the 1820s, a style of trousers known as Cossacks become very popular in England and the US, which are basically copied from the Cossack cavalry from the War of 1812. Sorry, not the War of 1812, the Napoleonic Wars. My apologies. And that becomes a very fashionable style of these kind of loose-fitting trousers. So I would, for the sake of this presentation tonight, err more on the side of the looser fit, and I've chosen a couple examples like that to show you from the OSV Museum collection. The first pair I'll talk about here are made out of a blue wool. We actually just mounted these on display in our needle and thread exhibit at the museum. So if you do live locally and want to actually see them in person, you can come out and check them out. But the real kind of important parts of how these fit in the time period, first off, the waistline is pretty high with these pantaloons. It does come well above the belly button, almost up to the sternum in some cases. So they're very, very high-waisted compared to what we're used to today. They usually have suspenders to hold them up, which does a really good job of keeping them in position. And they're, I find, very, very comfortable to wear. In terms of how they all kind of fit together here, they have what's called a fall. So this small flap that is right over the fly, effectively, as we'd call it today. And that's going to be the most common style you're going to see in our time period. Later on in the 20s, you'll start to see the broad falls coming in. But really in 1824, the narrow fall in one form or another is going to be the most common. You can kind of see from the image I have here at right, when the pants are actually opened up, how all these kind of pieces fit together with the pocket and the fall being opened up right there. So we have the blue wool example here, but white is also a very, very good choice, just like with shirts, for a pair of pantaloons. These, again, you can see have a narrow fall, fairly loose fitting as well. And I would recommend, and Carrie and I did not coordinate this with all the Laughing Moon stuff, it just kind of worked out, that if you are just looking for a commercially available pattern, I have not personally worked with this Laughing Moon pattern, but I know a lot of people who have, and they highly recommend it. It does give you a lot of flexibility with different styles of pantaloons you can make too, from baggier fits to much more tailored ones. So this would be my recommendation if you're trying to find a pattern for making your own pantaloons. But you know, cottons, linens, and woolens are certainly all appropriate. I would err more on the side of fairly plain cloth for this time period. You do start to see more checkered patterns and stripes and things like that that start to come in by the 1830s. But I think especially for the types of events we're talking about here, solid colors are really going to be the best, and white is probably your best bet, or some variation on white, not like a pure bleached white, but more of kind of a natural creamy white like the ones we see right here. If you are feeling more adventurous, though, and do want to actually draft your own pattern, again, I will reference back to the Tailor's Friendly Instructor. I've used this pattern numerous times. I just finished a pair of Cossack pantaloons actually recently for the 1824 events. And this pattern is excellent. It gives you a lot of different versatility for how these fit. They're the most comfortable pair of pants that I own, and every kind of variation, I should say, based on this pattern. So I would highly recommend this if you are into the actual drafting process yourself. So moving on to vests from there. So I really just included one example here. There are certainly some variations, but this is one, again, we actually just mounted on display at OSV, that I feel is a pretty good representative example of a typical style or cut, I guess, of man's vest from the mid-1820s. So you can see that it's basically a square cut vest. So there's just square cut across the bottom, coming down to basically right around the belly button, maybe a little bit below that. So still fairly high-waisted, but making its way down, as Carrie was saying, the same with women's clothing in the time period. It's basically a straight, a straight front coming up, but not buttoning all the way up. You do still see some vests of more of the earlier, like 18-teens style that are still being recommended in tailoring manuals in the period, which are very similar to this and often do button all the way up the front and have a little bit of a taller standing collar. But if you notice this one here, the gore, the neckline is actually set down fairly low, and that becomes the most popular style you'd see in the mid-1820s, with a fairly low standing collar as well. Sometimes they actually get to be only, an inch or so tall at the front, and then going to maybe about 2 inches at the back, with these welt pockets like you can see at the side right here for stowing handkerchiefs and things like that. And you're not going to see the types of welt pockets that we commonly think of with vests in the 19th century for like putting your timepiece, your pocket watch in with all the chains and things like that. You're still primarily seeing your timepiece in the time period being stored in a watch pocket or a fob pocket in your pantaloons, instead of in your actual vest in the period. But that's getting more into the accessories. You can see with the vest, though, it is basically made to be adjustable. On the back of it right here, it does have a single piece linen back that does have these small ties, and that's how you're going to be able to adjust the fit over the other garments you're wearing. And the great thing about this is it does give you the availability to change it as you might shift a little bit depending on the season, and how much you might be exercising or really enjoying the holidays. So it gives you a little bit of flexibility there. In terms of patterns, so going to the Tailor's Friendly Instructor, because this is a London publication, there are going to be some pieces in here that are a lot more fashionable. So this actually does show more of a shawl collar vests for the period, and even some of the kind of pointed waistlines that become more popular in America by the end of the 1820s and 1830s. So you could certainly use this for getting your basic design, and the way that the vest is shown, the one that's kind of in the lower right here of that one plate, is probably your best bet for starting to draft a vest of this pattern from this tailoring manual, because it does have the same kind of look to it. I will just kind of point out, we do have in our new needle and thread publication that we just put out this past year, back in March, there is actually a pattern there for a vest that actually works really well for this time period. It's a vest that was modified. We have it listed as late 1820s, but you could fudge this a little bit earlier as well in terms of the basic style and cut of this vest. Aside from that, I haven't, to be completely honest, found a lot of good commercially made patterns that really have a true 1820s style of vest. They tend to be either earlier or later, more of the the 1812 style or more of the Victorian style. So with some kind of fudging, you can manipulate some of those patterns to make them a little bit more appropriate for what you'd see in 1824, 1825. So now we'll get to coats. So I've only included one coat here because I really wanted to focus on the details of what a man's coat in 1824, 1825 would look like. And this is a great example that we have in the OSU Museum collection. We're actually going to be having this conserved soon to also go out on an exhibit, trying to get lots of the textile collection out. But this one, unfortunately, has no provenance, but is, I feel, a really good example of what an 1820s coat looks like. So you can see the waistline here, again, is kind of going a little bit lower than what we would have seen in the 18 teens. The sleeves are fairly long, so they would actually basically extend down to just about your knuckles in the 1820s, so much longer than what we're used to today. And that begins to change even by the 1830s, but they're still fairly long and by the mid-1820s. The collar, and I'll get into more details of the collar, but it is a large kind of folded over collar that has often some variation of an M notch or a square notch, kind of decorative detail with these kind of flaring points coming out. These are going to be heavily structured to give it that shape that it has. So I don't have a lot of detailed pictures of how this really goes together, but when you're constructing a man's coat in the time period, most of the work in terms of the internal structure is put into the collar to give it this really kind of resilient and stiff roll that comes over. So it looks very impressive when you actually put this on and gives it a lot of shape on its own. Even when this garment is laying flat, the collar wants to kind of stand up and have shape, and that's an intentional way that you tailor the garment with lots of pad stitching and layers and interfacing and things like that. It is what some might call a cutaway coat, so it is a tailcoat. Tailcoats are the most common style of coat you will see a man wearing in the 1820s. There are certainly some frock coats with full skirts coming in. There are some short roundabout jackets that do not have any tails that are also being worn for work and for leisure as well, but tailcoats are really your best bet. In this case, it is a heavy blue wool one. Woolen tailcoats are worn all year round in the time period for formal wear, but certainly, as Carrie was saying, depending on when your event is happening and the type of event that you're going to, it would certainly be appropriate too to have cotton, even linen, and sometimes patterned, checked, striped, printed pattern, things like that for a much more summer weight type of tailcoat that you could wear that has a lot less structure. So if you're looking to be more comfortable in the warmer months, the tailcoats of the period that are designed for summer wear are essentially like a skin that you wear in the summertime. They provide no warmth. They're really just there so that you look properly dressed, even if it is 95 degrees out with high humidity. It also gives you a couple extra pockets you can throw your stuff into. But looking at some of the details of the cut, you can see here the collar, these kind of dramatic points coming off of the lapels here, even the point coming off of the collar. That's a very iconic style that you see in the 1820s. You will sometimes see what's called an M-notch collar, where instead of having this little flat section going across, it actually has more of a point. And that's a style that is earlier and actually extends well beyond the 1820s for a lot of tailcoats. And then lastly, what I'll point at for just kind of a basic construction detail about coats in the period, for this coat here, there is no waist seam. So I'll actually pass on to the next slide here to show you some different patterns that are available. In the mid-1820s, you start to see a waist seam being added to coats. And you can see that in this pattern here for this brown tail coat, which is really a very, very fashionable cut of coat for 1824 and 1825. The coat that I have here shown at left of this pattern is probably more appropriate for what you would see in the early 1820s, more of a holdover with the old style that does not actually have the separate skirt that's pieced in or separate tails that are pieced in. So I would say that either of these patterns could actually work, and both these come with really great details of the internal construction, and lots of other great stuff about how to actually put these things together. I would definitely, again, reference, though, if you're trying to find inspiration for what you would want to look for in a coat that you might be reproducing and have made for you, just look online at museum collections. There are lots and lots of great examples between OSV, Williamsburg, Genesee Country Village, places like that that are putting more of their things online. And there's some excellent examples that could be an inspiration for you. But I would recommend these two patterns. Unless, again, you would like to go down the route of being a little bit more ambitious. The Tailor's Friendly Instructor does have a coat pattern there, and also deals with a lot of complex body shapes as well. So there's some really great information in there that could be very helpful if you would like to actually draft your own coat pattern. In terms of accessories, so handkerchiefs, stocks, different types of neckwear are being worn in the time period. I have the image here of Southworth Holland again, because you can see he is actually wearing what is probably a white cotton or linen neckcloth or handkerchief that's tied around his neck, keeping his collar up nice and tall, which is the fashion in the time period, not folded over, but nice and tall. And very often they're going to be starched collars to keep them nice and tall as well. But I have a few examples here of some different handkerchiefs that we have in the OSV Museum collection. Lots of different museums have very similar ones with lots of different varieties of patterns and things like that. I will say Burnley and Trowbridge in Virginia has made a lot of great reproductions of these handkerchiefs. We're actually working with them to have some reproduced from our collection as well, which we're excited about. But that could be a good place for you to go to look to find some good handkerchief you can use. I would recommend, certainly, if you're looking for more of a formal look, going with either black or white, black being more for day wear, white being more for evening wear. But if you're looking for more of kind of an everyday look for someone from the time period, then these more kind of patterned styles you would see might be more appropriate for the type of look you're pulling together. Also, some of the same accessories that Carrie referenced earlier in terms of gloves and ribbons, things like that. Those are also being worn by men in the time period. So we have this a great example of a pair of gloves from the historic Deerfield collection that actually has Washington and Lafayette side by side stamped onto them. So there are very similar examples for men. We have the ribbon here. This is another example we have in the OSV collection. Neilhurst in Virginia has actually been reproducing these as well, along with the sashes like Carrie showed earlier. So there are options for you to purchase these things today, not the gloves. You might be able to, again, buy a pair of cotton gloves and have a stamp made, something like that, if you want to get creative to really go that extra mile to have some of these really neat accessories that were available. I didn't include it here because it's not necessarily men's clothing, but in the OSV Museum collection, we even have an example of a pair of children's bootees, these really great little red Moroccan leather bootees that have Lafayette's face stamped on the front of them. So there are lots of different types of these kind of collectible accessories that were available in the time period. I'll talk a little bit about hats now. So hats in the time period, that what we commonly think of as a top hat today is going to be the most common style. And there's a lot of variations within that. I included here a couple or actually a whole bunch of examples from Lloyd's Treatise on Hats, which is originally written in 1819 in London. The plates that I have here are actually from the 1821 edition. So these are a little bit closer to what we're looking at here. And you can just see the broad variety of hats that are available. This is a really neat book that is available on Google Books, just like the Tailor's Friendly Instructor, that has some really great information about not only the hats, but recommendations for who should wear these hats, depending on kind of, what they do for a living, their kind of, physical attributes, potentially their age, things like that. So it's a funny read, to be completely honest, to go through and kind of view what someone in the time period who is making hats is saying is an appropriate type of hat for a certain type of person to wear. My favorite is actually one that's recommended in there for an old man to be worn when he's trying to court young ladies. So there's some pretty great gems that you will find in Lloyd's Treatise of Hats, again, available online. And in terms of sourcing hats that you can wear, I will point out my good friend Matt Brankel in Boston, who is making hats and is doing it professionally right now. I have more Brinkle hats than I should probably admit, but he is making excellent round hats of the time period. You can see in the upper left-hand corner a wool round hat that is just a more of an everyday kind of hat from the 1820s. And then the one at right is actually a copy that he made specifically for someone who is portraying Lafayette in his 1824, 1825 tour. In this case, it's actually a fur that's been napped and then pressed, so it has that really nice shine and kind of brushed appearance to it. So I'd highly recommend, if you're looking for a period hat, to look up Matt Brinkle on Facebook. He's available there. I did just include one brief thing about shoes. I don't have as much information as what Carrie included, but shoes, just like for women, are kind of tricky to find for men in the period as well. But I included a pair that I actually wear at OSV when I'm out in costume. These were made in the Old Sturbridge Village shoe shop, and I should note, unfortunately, that shoe shop does not make any shoes for people outside the museum. The sole focus is just to make shoes for the museum. But I include this really as an example because looking at this shoe, although there are some suppliers, and we can include this in the list that Carrie and I will send out, they make shoes that are close for kind of like an everyday shoe of the time period. You'll notice these often look an awful lot like modern dress shoes too. So I will just kind of point this out. If you're looking back at this PowerPoint, if you're looking at other suppliers of shoes, they all kind of look like a modern Oxford shoe, this kind of low quarter shoe. There are certainly high boots that are worn in the period. There are pumps that are worn for more formal occasions, for balls, things like that. But this is a really good example of just kind of an ordinary shoe from the time period that you'd see a lot of men wearing, whether for work or in some cases for more dressier wear as well. They might be dressed up a little bit more with ribbons and things like that and made out of finer materials, but the same basic style of shoe is what I have up on the screen right now. So I wanted to kind of come back to the two portraits we started with to see again. We looked at all the different pieces. Hopefully now you can see how all these pieces are represented in the two different portraits. Again, the tall standing collars, the neckcloth or stock in some way that's helping to keep that up. We can see the ruffle on the front of Southworth's shirt right here was we actually have a pleated front on the front of this shirt for the unidentified man. We can see the vests that have kind of the stubby little standing collars, one being striped, one just being what appears to be almost like a black silk, a fairly simple one. And then in both cases, they're wearing fairly ordinary tailcoats, one black, one blue, very typical colors you would see in the time period. Blue is probably the most common you would see, but black, brown being probably the second or third behind that. So this kind of pulls everything together for you to see what these looks again would look like in totality. I do feel that we should also mention when talking about men's clothing, I mean, so many of the accounts of when Lafayette came through often reference the militia. The militia was a major part of his escort, being, going from place to place, wherever he was in the United States. But also there's lots of accounts of him attending sham battles, again, parades, any of these kinds of salutes, things like that. And I know that there are a lot of military reenactors out there who are hoping to somehow be involved with these events. So what I want to do more for education in this case here is to show really what the militia in the 1820s are looking like as a reference. Doing 1820s militia myself, there's only a handful of us to do it. I'll show a picture of our group at the end that is actually an 1824 group. But I will say that the materials for 1820s militia are even harder to find than for regular civilian wear in the time period. So I'm not trying to dissuade anyone from news. I welcome the ability to, or the chance to talk with anyone and work with anyone who would like to actually get some more information on an appropriate militia uniform they could potentially wear for some of these events. But I thought I'd just share some images here. So we have 3 different plates from a multi-arm drill manual that was printed in Philadelphia in 1823 that show a variety of different militia companies that give you a sense of the different colors of coats and the different varieties of caps they're wearing, all sort of based on what the U.S. Army implements in 1821 as their new fashionable style of uniform. So basically, the militia in the period is taking what the U.S. Army is wearing. They're taking all the really cool plates they saw from the soldiers from Napoleon's army. And then they're also just thinking, what do I want to wear as a militia soldier? And putting all that together, the militia companies would vote on whatever their own uniform would be. So in this case, we can see some examples of what different militia companies in Philadelphia were wearing, but there's also regulations that went out. So I have an example here of the regulations from 1823 for Massachusetts that go into some detail about what the militia was actually wearing. And there's lots of records that survive. The National Guard archives in Massachusetts have a lot of these details, and different historical societies will also have information on these depending on the state you belong to. But in the OSV Research Library collection, we have one of these general orders that talks about what the militia was actually wearing. And I have an example here of a general staff officer's uniform that we actually have in the OSV Museum collection. So this can give you some kind of broad strokes of how the militia might have been dressed, but there's also lots of information out there that you'll find, again, in local historical societies. In this case, this was from the Massachusetts National Guard archives, some uniform returns of what various militia companies are wearing, in this case in Boston in 1823. So this works out very well for us because in Massachusetts, they actually have new uniform regulations that come out in 1822. And basically what the state militia requires is that all militia companies that are actually uniformed volunteer militia companies send returns back to the adjutant general of the militia saying exactly what they're wearing to make sure that they're in compliance. And if they're not in compliance, they basically are kind of grandfathered in, but the next time they get a uniform, they need to have something that fits the actual regulations, what the state says. Even with that, though, there's a lot of variation, and you see a lot of, especially the militia companies in Boston, like we have reflected in this manuscript here, that are getting a little bit more creative. They're wearing uniforms that don't fit the regulations, but they feel are very dashing and flashy, and that's really what it's all about in the militia of the time period, is having very impressive uniforms. And I'm sure when they were getting ready for Lafayette, that was what a lot of them were thinking about, and having these really fashionable uniforms and trying to kind of outdo each other with how much gold or silver they were wearing, how tall their plumes were, all that type of stuff. So I do have just one depiction here to kind of close of our impression of the Oxford Light Infantry. So they form in Oxford, Massachusetts in 1824. You can see the bell crown leather caps with the tall plumes, the tailcoat coatees, triple rows of silver plated buttons, the white pantaloons. So this is a very, very, very typical style of militia uniform you would have seen in the 1820s when Lafayette was coming through. All right, so with that, I'm going to stop my share now. And I know that Carrie and I have been talking now for, well, about almost an hour and a half. So we want to open this all up to you folks so you can ask any questions you do have. Chuck, I'll let you start, I guess. But again, we will provide a document.
Let me help with this. If you don't mind, I'm going to ask people to raise their hand. And the way you do that is your reactions button at the bottom. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a reactions button and it says raise hand. And you can see I just raised my hand. Do you see that? So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and then I'll call upon you and you can unmute and ask your question. Does that sound good? All right. So I don't see any other raised hands though. And I know we have questions. Is anybody having trouble finding the raised hand button? Could this possibly mean we have no questions?
I do see a question in the chat.
Okay, I do see some questions in the chat.
Yeah, so kind of backing up, looking at those real quickly. Looks like Jeanette had a question about how one of the dress closed in the back. Most of the dresses that close in the back are a series of hooks and eyes, roughly an inch apart. So they are typically much, much closer together than even the patterns list. And a general rule of thumb, like about an inch apart seems to work pretty well and match what a lot of the originals are. They're the Burnley and Trowbridge workshop, an update. It was in May and not March. My apologies. The registration opens next month. I think that's what I was thinking of. Jeanette Watts, another familiar name. Hello, Jeanette, is teaching a workshop on 1825 ball gowns in Ohio in June. So check out the chat and touch base with her. And as of 6:47, the Kentucky workshop with fig leaf and tumbling tresses had one spot left. So there's someone's email in the chat about that. And then let's see, the recording will be available. And then Josh, most recently, that's the one I just noticed, The best place to purchase all the items. And so as Derek and I were saying, like a lot of these places are just not, most of them are just not available kind of off the rack. And for some of the women's clothing, some of those links that I'll be including are finished garments. So some of the bonnets, and so on, some of the petticoats, you can find some sources on Etsy. What we were hoping with this presentation is that by kind of giving a framework for the rough styles and outlines and silhouettes you're looking for, that can also help make informed decisions as you're shopping from some of the makers that are providing these goods out there. So I'll turn that back to Chuck now.
Thank you, Carrie. All right, Richard, you had your hand raised. Could you unmute yourself and ask a question, please?
Sure, thanks, Chuck. I had a question about the black and red feathers that were noted for Lafayette when he led his light division. Did any of that follow through in any of this celebration that came back on the 50th anniversary? I've never seen a display of that or anybody wearing those, and I was curious if anybody had seen anything like that.
So I can't speak specifically to the relation to Lafayette's light infantry and that kind of correlation. I will say, though, in the Massachusetts militia, a black plume that was tipped in red was actually what infantry officers were supposed to be wearing. So they do still have plumes they're wearing, but I don't know if there's any of that that's really a nod to Lafayette specifically, or more just generally those kind of, two-tone or sometimes even three-tone plumes you might have seen being worn. So I can't say personally from the research that I've done if you see that type of carryover from any of the accounts of people that were visiting.
Okay, thank you, Derek. Appreciate it.
Okay, we have Cassie. Cassie, you have your hand raised. Would you be so kind as to unmute yourself and ask your question, please?
So I actually have two questions.
Oh, no, Cassie, only one. I'm sorry, only one. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding, Cassie.
Oh, okay, good.
I'm joking.
So you talk about waistlines lowering and raising depending on how fashionable you are. But in terms of necklines, do we tend to see higher necklines? I mean, most of the examples that you showed were quite high.
Yeah, thanks, Cassie, for asking that. So about necklines, yes, the norm is still relatively high necklines. So you don't tend to see as many scoop necks for this period. So the kind of deeper scoops from the Regency, it tends to be up a little bit higher, and it's widening. So the waistlines are lowering, the necklines are raising from previous periods, but getting wider and wider until, again, being very familiar with the 1830s myself, there's a point where they're almost off the shoulder, and you have the stays and corsets are kind of supporting that with very wide set shoulder straps. So anything that's sort of, I feel where my collarbone is, kind of within the collar, like the outside edge of the clavicle there, and roughly like where, if you can see me on screen, kind of like where my the neckline of my dress is, like you're not seeing a lot that are scooped much lower than that, unless you start getting into some of the kind of crossover dresses, the ones that have the V necklines and or that are surplus wrap, then those naturally do have a deeper line. The exception will be for evening wear. Evening wear is, just like it is today, is often going to be a little bit more daring, because it's when we show off the goods in the evening. So, and you had a second question?
Okay. Yes. So moving from neckline and in between the waist, the bosom. What is the bosom doing? Is it staying up high? Is it moving down? Does it matter depending on what you're wearing?
So it is, well, it depends on your how frequently you're changing those out. One of the things I do love about kind of this post 1790s period is that it is one of the first times in history that it's women who are designing the stays and corset patterns and making them, and it is a garment being made at home. As someone who, identifies and presents female, like I know how my female body works and how best to support it. So as someone who's designing clothes for said body, I can kind of adjust for all those curves and so on. The ideal is for the bust to be lifted and separated, but not, again, it is dropping along with the waistline. It is still raised, you're still fighting gravity, but it is that not sort of, it's not sort of that hop high level that you see in the kind of 1805 to 1810, 1815 period. It is dropping closer to a natural level, if you'll excuse my language, if you're sort of naturally perky anyway, and not fighting gravity on a daily basis, then it's getting closer to that point, and you do tend to have a little bit more separation, that there is sort of two distinct halves there.
Wow, this is absolutely the best Zoom I've ever hosted for sure. Thank you so much. We had as many as 80 attendees today, so I just want to say very well attended. Any last minute questions from everybody? I thought I saw one other hand raised, but they lowered their hand. Oh, Evie, you have a question. Could you unmute it? Thank you.
Yeah, so on the men's clothes, there's lots of buttons. Can you talk at all about what are on the buttons, or what, about the buttons?
Yeah, absolutely. So for regular men's clothing, the time period, especially for coats, I guess I'll start there, because those are the ones that I think are the most kind of eye-catching based on what we saw. And most of the other buttons are covered up for the most part, except for what you might see on the vest. But basically brass disc buttons, or coin buttons are sometimes called nowadays, are going to be one of the most common styles you're going to see. It's really nice to have that kind of contrasting shiny brass with whatever, the black or the blue coat might be. But also, it's very, very common to see buttons that are covered basically in the same cloth as the body, or some kind of complementary color. So, for instance, the portrait that I had of Southworth Howland, he's wearing a black tailcoat that has black buttons. More than likely, those buttons are actually either a wood or a horn mold that's been covered in a black silk. So it drapes very nicely, and it has a very nice kind of tight, small appearance to it on the button. When it comes to military buttons, there's a huge variety that you see on the militia uniforms. And we actually have in the museum's collection an example of a man's tailcoat that's a little bit later than what we're talking about here, that does actually have military buttons that was added to it. Now, we're not sure exactly when that was done, if that was when well after the time period that it was worn, but the fact they are of the same time period does make me kind of wonder, was this someone who was a militia officer that was very proud of his service in the militia, and even in civilian life still wore a coat that had military buttons on it? So there's a lot of different varieties you see, but I would say for regular kind of like everyday coats, brass and then cloth covered are your best bet.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you very much. So folks, your first opportunity to dress like you're in 1824 is March 7th. We're holding a gala at Villa Albertine, the lovely French building on 5th Avenue at the park. More details on the gala can be found at Lafayette200.org. March 7th in New York is our first kickoff event for the bicentennial, and we expect music and dancing and everybody dressing in a period costume. So we're very excited for that. And again, look for more about that at Lafayette200.org. In fact, you can find everything on Lafayette200.org, all about what we're doing for the bicentennial in later this year in 2024 and 2025. So we're super excited. We got great news today that the United States Capitol is going to have an event on December 10th, 2024, exactly 200 years to the day that Lafayette addressed the joint session of Congress, the first foreigner to do so. So things are just falling into place, great events happening, and it all starts. The big day is August 15th, 2024, as we celebrate the first day Lafayette stepped on land in the United States for the first time in over 40 years. So go to Lafayette200.org and check us out. Harry, Derek, you guys were amazing. This was fascinating stuff. 80 people. Let's give them a big hand of applause. Thank you so much. Oh, and I think I have one more question from Cassie. Cassie's got her hand raised again. Hurry up, Cassie. I got a basketball game to watch.
Sorry, real quick. The description online for that event in March looked like it might be 18th century instead of 1820s. Should we be doing 1820s instead?
Yeah, I would say 1820s is the way to go. Although we will have Lafayette dressed in his National Guard uniform for this event. He will not be in his 1820s event. So if you do prefer to come in a 18th century event costume rather than a 19th century costume, that would be fine as well. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. And it was really great to see everybody tonight. And I wish you all a very happy 2024. Happy New Year. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.